Opening credits. His Temptation. Bad Boy Romantic Suspense. By Selena Coffey. Auto-narrated, using Google technology. Chapter 1. Julie Dumbarton sat in the very last seat of the Greyhound bus. She didn't like sitting next to the chemical-smelling toilet stall, but she needed the security of knowing no one was sitting behind her. She was impatient for the bus to depart, afraid that if they sat there too long, the man that was hunting her would find her. She looked out of the window into the night, but all she could see was her own reflection, her red hair creeping out from under her hat, blue eyes rimmed with dark circles from lack of sleep. Even her cheekbones seemed sharper than when she had left home months ago. She thought back to the time before the city, when she'd stupidly driven the getaway car for her boyfriend Axel. She hadn't known he was going to rob a bank, but that wouldn't matter to the cops. The prosecutor would surely point out that she had known Axel was up to no good. She'd left him after that. Left him and moved to the city for a fresh start. What a joke that had been. She'd had no marketable skills and couldn't find a job. She should have known when the lovely Martin Richter had taken her in, that he was a con man. An unprincipled pimp. She'd actually thought he was in love with her, until he had given her to another man. After that, she'd stolen from his wallet time and time again, until she had the bus fare home. But he'd found her stash and given her a black eye, so in the end she had to call her parents for a bus ticket home. She'd spent the evening pretending to drink with Martin, refilling his glass time after time, until he finally passed out on the couch. Then she'd snuck past the other rooms and down and out into the street, running barefoot to the bus station, her feet silent on the warm pavement so the men wouldn't hear her footfalls. "I need to pick up my ticket," she'd said, panting with exertion and nerves at the ticket window. "What?" asked the clerk behind the counter. "Say again." "I have a ticket here." Julie spoke slower, tried to regulate her breathing. "You must pay for ticket," the clerk said. "No," Julie was starting to panic. She wasn't sure how much time she had before the bus left. "My parents paid for the ticket. I just need to pick it up." The clerk had finally understood, found the ticket and handed it to Julie, after she'd produced her ID. Then she'd padded quietly onto the bus, still holding her shoes. Shouting broke out in the station just as the bus engine roared to life, and Julie slid down in her seat, hoping to slip unnoticed out of Martin Richter's life. He didn't know where she was from, and with a little luck, he would never know where she had gone. Julie woke when the bus pulled into her hometown terminal. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, it wasn't safe. The movement of the bus had lulled her, and she'd slept deeply the last 5 hours of the trip. She rubbed her eyes and looked out into the familiar downtown. Her parents were standing on the sidewalk beside the bus, arms folded, not talking to each other. There was nothing new about that. They hadn't had a proper conversation in the last 10 years, as far as Julie knew. She grabbed her backpack and climbed down out of the bus. Her mother burst into tears and threw her arms around Julie. "I'm okay, Mom," Julie said into her shoulder. "I'm fine." It wasn't true, of course, but she would never tell her mother what she'd been through. Looking over her mother's shoulder, she thought she saw someone standing in the shadows on the other side of the street, but she couldn't get a good look. Still, the figure reminded her of Axel, and she realized she'd still have to be careful. She'd put that life behind her, and that's where she wanted it to stay. "Why, thank goodness," her father said. "You're safe. Let's take you home." He took her backpack and walked away. "Mom? Mom?" Julie pulled away from her mother's embrace. "Come on, Mom, Dad already left." They followed her dad to the car and drove silently through the town toward their home. Once home, Julie made excuses to her parents and retreated to the sanctuary of her bedroom, the one place in the world she felt safe. She grabbed a towel from the linen closet and got gratefully into the shower. She let the water run and run, rinsing away the grime of the city life, the humiliation, the abuse. When the water ran cold, she got out of the shower, returned to the privacy of her room, and rummaged in her drawers for clothes she hadn't worn in months. When she pulled on her favorite jeans, she discovered they were too big for her now. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing for the first time that her hip bones jetted sharply, and her lower ribs were visible. There had been no mirrors in the house in the city, and she had no clue how emaciated she'd become. She dug around in a drawer for a belt, and cinched her jeans tight on her hips. So she was thin, she thought, so what? All she had to do was eat ice cream every day for a week. She should get back to normal, at least normal looking. She might never feel like the same person again. The jeans looked silly bunched around her waist, so she slipped into a dress instead. It was a flowy sleeveless shift with a scoop neck that dropped to just above her knees. Comfortable and homey. This dress was full of happy memories. It was when she went to flop down on her bed that she noticed the envelope on her pillow. She smiled, thinking one of her friends must be welcoming her home. She stuck her finger under the envelope flap and tore it open, pulling out not a card, but a single sheet of lined paper, the kind they use in elementary school. There were 5 words printed on it. "You will never be free." A cold chill ran down her back. Julie dug through her drawers for a clean pair of socks and grabbed her sneakers out of the closet. She dumped her backpack on the bed, shaking out all the bits of detritus she collected in the corners during her stay in the city. Then she stuffed a change of clothes and a sweatshirt into the bag, dropped to her hands and knees beside the bed, and felt for the slit she'd cut in the bottom of the box spring for the money she'd stashed there months ago. Her fingers found the edges of the envelope, and she slid it from the mattress, but when she opened it there was no money there. She dropped her head to the floor in despair. Who had taken her money? Well, it didn't matter, she was just going to have to survive without it. She went to the window, opened the lower sash, and slid out onto the back porch roof. She inched down the metal as quietly as she could, rolled over onto her stomach and slid her legs out into the air until her hips could bend. As her legs dropped, she kicked around, feeling with her toes for a gap in the lattice. When she found it, she crept slowly down as quietly as she could and dropped into the bushes at the back of the house. The backyard was dark, but luckily she knew where everything was. Nothing had changed in the weeks she had been away. She stepped out between the bushes and sat on the back doorstep to put her shoes on. The house was dark, and she knew her parents were sleeping. She made her way quietly past the garage at the back of the yard, out through the gate, and into the back alley. There she took a quick look to see that no one was skulking in the alley, and she turned right and trotted toward town. She walked through the small downtown and along the river until she reached the bridge. There she sat on the parapet watching the river flow and wondered what she should do. There were 1 or 2 people that might be willing to help her, but there were no guarantees. She'd left town without a word to her friends, hadn't contacted them while she was away, and couldn't expect them to understand why she left. She would not go back to Axel. She would not get dragged back into that life. People who ran with Axel's gang didn't survive long, and there were plenty of freshly seeded mounds in the graveyard that could attest to that. Julie ducked down as a car approached the bridge, hiding in the shadows. Her parents wouldn't be looking for her yet, they wouldn't even be awake, but the problem with living in a small town was that nothing stayed secret for long. If someone saw her sitting on the bridge, her parents would be woken to a phone call telling them all about it. Julie had to remain unseen. She slid down off the bridge onto the bank of the river and walked south. If she made it down to the marina, she might be able to break into one of the boat houses the summer people kept there. Last summer Axel had shown her which boat houses had easy locks to pick, and which ones were hardly ever locked at all. The sky began to fade and brighten as she approached the marina, but it was still very early. There was no one on the docks. She hurried down the farthest jetty, and chose a house in a slip between 2 others where her movement might go unnoticed. She'd been here before. Unlike last time, the porch window slid easily open and she slipped inside. She wondered if the people who owned the houseboat even remembered it was theirs. No one had visited it in her memory, and it was exactly the same as last time she'd been there. There were 2 Cokes and a bottle of water in the fridge. She grabbed the water, reasoning it could be refilled, so it wasn't really stealing. She made her way upstairs and out onto the roof deck, grabbing a wall blanket from the linen closet on the way. She curled into one of the reclining deck chairs, pulled the blanket over her, swig to the water, and then let herself drift into sleep. Chapter 2. Axel Kehoe watched with amusement as Julie inched her way down the back porch roof. She'd been sneaking out of the house that way since she'd been 12 or 13. She didn't seem to realize that once she was over the age of majority, her parents couldn't stop her from leaving the house when she wanted to. Even in the dim light from the street lamp, Axel could see that Julie was a good 50 pounds lighter than when she left town. He'd heard rumors of what she'd been through, and it worried him. He should have never dragged her into that job, and he had regretted it ever since. Axel was a big man in his late 20s. Second in command to Eduardo Calzone, he knew that he must look bigger, harder and badder than any of the other gang members if he didn't want to be challenged on a weekly basis. So he had trained and continued to train. His hard work paid off. Axel was known as the baddest of the bad in 3 states. Now he used his training to follow Julie as silently and lethally as a big cat. Not many would be able to see him in the shadows, and those who did would know to stay away. When Julie headed for the marina, Axel had known where she was going. He cut ahead of her, trotting down the town roads instead of following her along the river. When Julie found the porch window open, it was because Axel had opened it for her. When she curled into the deck chair on the roof of the boathouse, he was watching her from the shadows. He was still watching when the sun rose high enough to rest on her face, and she opened her eyes. She did not look surprised to see him, but she gathered the blanket tighter around her, and her mouth thinned into a grim line. When Axel came to sit on the foot of her lounge chair, she tucked her feet under, pulling her legs further away from him. "Axel," she said. He could hear the pain in her voice. "Julie," he said. "You're back." The pain in her voice stabbed at his heart. She had been his girl, his one love, and he had failed her. He had not been able to protect her from himself. "It's hard to find a job when you don't have any skills," she said, and he could hear pain and anger in her voice now too. "People in the city, they aren't what they seem." "Julie," he started, but he didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. He longed to take her in his arms, to hold her and stroke her hair, and tell her how very sorry he was. "Axel," she said, "what are you doing here?" "I'm trying to keep you safe," he said. "Someone from the city followed you." "I should have known they wouldn't let me go that easily," she said. She dropped her head, and Axel had to stop himself from reaching out to her. "I don't know what to do," she despaired. "I can't stay here forever. If you found me, they could find me too." "I have an advantage," he said. "I know where you live. They'll be wondering where I am now, thinking they've lost me forever. Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe, and then I'll go tell your parents what happened." He stood up and reached out his hand. She hesitated. He was about to lament. He thought he'd never earn her trust again. She suddenly reached out and took his hand. He pulled her gently to her feet and led her down to the dock. When they reached the road, Axel pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a gang wannabe. Then he slid off his hoodie and draped it over her shoulders, with the hood drooping low over her face. "I can't see where I'm going," she said. "I'll fall." "I'll make sure you don't fall," he said. "I don't want anyone to see your face. If they don't know it's you, then it's less likely they'll rat us out." "Why only less likely?" she asked, her eyebrows drawn together as she looked out from under the heavy hood. "They aren't stupid," Axel said. "They'll see me and make the association. But at least they won't know for sure." It was less than 15 minutes later that black sedan slowed to a stop in front of them. Axel helped Julie into the back and slid into the front passenger seat, directing the driver back to the alley where his truck was parked behind a dumpster. They switched vehicles, Axel scanning the alley for watchers. He asked Julie to stay low in the seat, waved his grunt away, and waited until the sedan was out of sight before pulling away. He drove north along the outskirts of town and pulled onto the highway. 20 minutes out of town, he pulled back off the highway and drove to the Come On Inn. It was run down and frequented by married men and their younger girlfriends, but it was also discreet. For an extra $10, no one would ever know you'd been there. Not even the cops. He left Julie in the truck and went in the office to register and pay the extra fee. They parked at the far end of the building and walked up the stairs to a room with a view of the parking lot. It was hot and smelled like damp towels, but Axel believed it was the safest place Julie could be. Julie pulled off his hoodie and dropped it on the ugly brown and mauve print bedspread. It was worn and matched the bed itself, which had a sizable dip in the middle. "Why here?" Julie asked. "You couldn't take me to your apartment?" She sounded a little offended, and it put Axel on the defensive. "I live in the crib," he explained. "Everyone would know you were there. Some idiot would talk." "Oh. Of course." She picked up the remote and sat on the edge of the bed, focusing on the TV. "I gotta go now, Jules," he said, "but I'll be back later. Lock the door behind me." She nodded and did as he said without saying another word. Axel stomped down the stairs, arguing with himself. He'd shown Julie his apartment before she'd left town. She knew what it was like. He had private space, but it was in the middle of a building owned by his boss, the gang leader. The others who lived there knew too much about her. That she'd been forced into prostitution. They would never leave her alone. This was why he was going to have to get free of Eduardo. It wasn't going to be easy. He drove the 20 minutes back to town and parked under the building owned by Eduardo. He locked his truck and rode the elevator up to the 11th floor. There was only one floor above the one he lived on, and that floor was entirely made up of Eduardo's apartment and offices. He even had a roof garden for entertaining clients. It was a class outfit. Axel showered and dressed in a dark suit, slicking back his hair and slipping his feet into handmade shoes. He looked in the mirror and nodded. He looked good. He was sure that if he'd met Julie while wearing jeans, she would have never looked twice at him. But he'd been working, wearing this suit, and she'd fallen. Could he make her fall again? He took the elevator up to the 12th floor, stepped past the guards in the foyer and knocked at the large double doors. They were black and carved with flowers and swirls. Eduardo said they came from a building in Italy, but to Axel they looked oriental. A small man wearing an apron opened the door and ushered Axel into the living area, where Eduardo sat with a small blonde woman. He took one look at Axel in his business suit and sent the woman away, patting her ass as she walked off. "Sit down, Axel," Eduardo said, waving his hand at a couch on the other side of the glass and chrome coffee table. "Have a drink." Axel sat but refused the drink. He would need his wits about him if he was going to get out of this all in one piece. He sat upright, his instincts on high alert. He was about to speak when Eduardo preempted him. "How many years have you been my second, Axel? Is it 15 years yet?" Eduardo asked. 12 years. Before that, I was an enforcer." Axel didn't like to think about those years. He'd been young when he'd be recruited as an enforcer, only 21 years old. At the time, he thought it was an honor. He'd been stupid. Killing people was not an honor. "In my experience," Eduardo went on, "it's at 15 years when a second starts thinking about being first. Either taking out his boss or opening a branch in another city. Are you starting early, Axel? Have you begun to think about taking my place?" "No. I am loyal," Axel said and waited. He knew better than to protest his innocence. That would only make him look guilty to the older man. "Then why are you here, Axel?" "We have no business. The town is quiet. I am here with my lovely lady, relaxing, and in you come. You are dressed for war and you make me worry." Eduardo frowned at him, showing his disappointment. "I want to buy myself out, Eduardo. I know you have invested heavily in me. Training me. Teaching me the business. I am willing to offer you $100,000 to release my contract." It was a long shot, he knew, but he had to try. Eduardo threw back his head and laughed. And laughed some more. He laughed until his eyes ran with tears and he had to blow his nose. And when he stopped laughing, his face was dead serious. Axel wasn't afraid, but he knew Eduardo wanted him to be. $100,000 for my best man? You insult me, Axel. If a rival gang came here and offered me that deal, I would shoot him dead where he stood. I see that you undervalue yourself. You are modest, and that is a positive trait. But let me make it very clear, no amount of money will buy your freedom from me. When I am too old to hold off the wolves, you will step into my position, or you will die. Those are the only ways which you will leave my employ. Do you understand me, Axel? Eduardo's voice was low and menacing. Axel didn't trust his voice to remain neutral in the face of his anger, so he didn't speak. He nodded once. Then get out. And don't come back until I call you. I might change my mind and shoot you instead. Eduardo's voice was low and cold. Axel did as he was asked. Chapter 3. Julie locked the door and flopped back onto the bed after Axel left, her mind a whirl of confusion. She still felt such a strong attraction to him, and she wasn't sure why he'd rescued her. Did he feel responsible for her? Guilty? She grabbed a pillow and covered her face with it. She wanted to scream with frustration, but she couldn't draw attention to herself. It would be just her luck that someone would call the cops, and she'd be on the evening news, all because she couldn't control herself. Why did Martin follow her? It's not like he wanted her anymore. He said she was too scrawny to ever make him much money. All she did was get scrawnier, eating as little as she could, so maybe he would cut his losses and let her go. He'd beat her bloody when he discovered she'd been stealing from him, stashing the money under her mattress. But that had only made her more determined. She'd stolen a cell phone from one of the other girl's clients and called her mom. She'd thought she was free, but no. They would hunt her forever. Here she was with Axel. She had to be careful or she'd lose her heart again. That would be a mistake. After a while, she tossed the pillow aside and got up to leave a voice message for her parents. She wanted them to know she was okay. She flipped through the channels on the TV for a while, but the motel didn't have cable, and there was nothing on but talking heads. She was more than a little antsy when Axel knocked on the door. She peeked through the curtains to be sure it was him before she opened the door. "Wow," she said. "You look great." And he did. He changed into a dark suit that looked like it was tailor-made just for him. She felt a little foolish when she realized it probably was made just for him. Axel had to be making some pretty solid funds working for Eduardo. He stepped in and closed the door behind him, making sure it was locked. He dropped the bag he was carrying on the floor near the desk and sat in the chair facing her. He looked defeated, and she wondered what he had been doing. It occurred to her that she owed him for rescuing her and for finding her a safe place to stay. She stood slowly and took his hands, pulling him up out of the chair. She slid his jacket off over his shoulders and hung it in the closet. Then she knelt and slid off his shoes, his hand on her shoulder for balance. When she went for his belt buckle, he joked back and she whispered, "Relax. It's okay." She unbuckled his pants and slid them over his ankles. She let him sit down again and slid the pants over his feet. She folded and hung the pants in the closet next to the suit jacket. He was wearing boxer shorts covered with green turtles, and she had to try hard not to laugh. She focused on his dress shirt, untying the black silk tie. She had to breathe deep to keep a straight face. Men were so sensitive about their boxers, and she didn't want to ruin the mood. Not that there really was a mood, he was staring at her like she had grown a second head. She hung his shirt and tie, and when she came back to him, he had removed his socks and placed them neatly with his shoes. She clicked on the TV, and then off again when she remembered there was no cable. She went over to the little radio on the bedside table, twirling the dial until she found some easy listening music. Her time in the city had taught her that the wrong music could totally spoil the mood for a man. Something innocuous, like easy listening, wouldn't add to the excitement, but it wouldn't kill the mood either. She chose a song with a decent beat and began to sway to the music. She danced her way to where he was sitting, leaning down to brush her lips across his ear.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
They lay, coupled together until a shadow passed the curtained window, and they both tensed. Axel pulled out of her with a quiet, "Sorry, Jules," and grabbed a pair of sweats from his duffel. He pulled them on over the now damp boxers and went to stand next to the window. Without moving the curtain, he put his eye to the crack between the drape and the window frame. Then he beckoned her over. She came to stand beside him, still,
censored,
and put her own eye to the gap. What she saw made her jump back, her hand to her mouth. She looked at Axel, her eyes wide and mouth, "It's him." Axel nodded and motioned for her to go into the bathroom, but before she could move, there was a pounding at the door. "I know you're in there, Julie, open the door," Martin Richter said. Julie squeaked and clung to Axel. He motioned to the bathroom again, but she shook her head vigorously and dug her fingers into his arms. Martin pounded again. "You got 5 seconds to open this door, you little cow," he said. 1, 2, 3, and then he opened fire. The bullets sprayed through the door and shattered the window, then back toward the door again. In the ringing silence that followed, there was only the sound of boots running away, and everything was quiet again. Axel slumped against her and she realized he was bleeding. "Of course he's bleeding, you idiot," she thought. "He was standing between you and the gunfire." She half dragged him over to the bed and laid them there to examine his wounds. He was alert, but quiet. Julie thought he was clenching his jaw against the screams of pain that he wouldn't let go. Axel had 3 bullet wounds, a through and through in one thigh, another in his side, and an entry wound only near his shoulder. They were all leaking blood. She reached for the bedside phone, but Axel grabbed her hand. "No," he said. "I'm wanted by the police. You can't get help." "You'd rather be dead than in jail?" She was spitting mad. "There's blood everywhere, and you've got a bullet in your shoulder." "Doesn't matter, no help." Axel put his good hand to his side and grimaced. "Hurts like a cow." Julie was standing there,
censored,
hands on hips, staring at him, when the manager stuck his head through the curtains at the broken window. He looked at her and smiled. "You better get some clothes on, sweetheart. We gotta move you out of here." The manager came in through the ruined door with a first aid kit and slapped some gauze and tape on Axel, while Julie grabbed her sweats and a t-shirt out of her backpack and put them on. Axel said he could walk, but his wounds began to bleed as he moved. The manager ran for a wheelchair he kept in the office, and he wheeled Axel to the maintenance elevator, while Julie grabbed their belongings and followed behind. Julie could hear sirens approaching as they wheeled Axel into a basement apartment. The manager left, closing the door behind him, leaving Julie to cope with Axel in the dark. Chapter 4. Axel woke in the dark. Memories swirled through his head, or were they dreams? He remembered the intense pain when Julie cut the bullet from his shoulder. Then later being too hot, Julie holding a cloth to his head, making him swallow cool liquid. He put a hand on his side where the bullet had gone through. The skin around the wound was cool. No infection. He felt his thigh. No infection there either. He was trying to reach the wound on his shoulder when the light clicked on. Axel looked around the little room. He was in the only bed, barely wide enough to hold him. Julie was in an uncomfortable-looking armchair next to the bed, her hand on the lamp, blinking sleepily. The only other objects worth speculating about were the 2 doors. One to the bathroom, the other one the way out, he supposed. The room was dingy and dark. There were no windows. It was the perfect place for him to hide while recuperating. "How are you feeling?" Julie asked, getting to her feet to feel his forehead. "I was beginning to think that fever was never going to break." She lifted his shirt and peeled back the dressing. "This is much better," she said. "I couldn't get you to swallow much, so I packed the wound with antibiotic powder. I didn't know if it would help or not. Roll over a little so I can look at your back." He gritted his teeth as she poked at the wound on his back. It hurt like a sob, but he'd be damned if he'd act like an ungrateful a-hole. He was willing to bet she hadn't been fully asleep the entire time he'd been healing. "How long was I out?" he asked. She sat back in the chair, and the light illuminated the dark circles under her eyes, her hands shaking. With fatigue or hunger, he wondered. "A couple of days," she said. "I was scared to death." She ran her hand through her hair. I need a shower. You haven't showered? What about food? Have you eaten? Slept? He felt the anger start to flow, but he stamped it down. He wasn't angry at her so much as the situation. There had been no one to help her. The manager brought me a sandwich, but there's no shower down here. Just a toilet and a sink, so I couldn't shower. She closed her eyes. I've got some money in my wallet, he said. Take it and my truck and get some food. You'll be all right. Just go straight to the truck and lock yourself in. I just want to close my eyes for a minute, she said, squirming around in the chair trying to get comfortable. An impossibility, by the looks of the chair. Come here, he said. Slide in beside me. He moved so his back was on the very edge of the bed and held the blanket up. For a moment she looked like she would refuse, but then she deflated and slid in with him. Whatever her hesitation had been, exhaustion had trumped it. He stayed until her breathing was deep and even, then he slid his arm out from under her and got out of bed. He was a little unsteady on his feet at first. He went into the tiny bathroom and splashed some water over his face and the back of his neck from the dirty sink. He found his duffel under the end of the bed and pulled on some clothes, found his wallet and the key to the room, and let himself out, locking the door behind him. He hoped the thug who'd shot him thought he was dead, but hope isn't an emotion to act on. He was slow to come out into the daylight, cracking the door open and scanning the throughway before emerging. When he reached the parking lot, he stood in the shadows scanning the parking lot for unusual activity. But it was Monday morning, there was only one other vehicle in the lot, and it was locked and empty. He got in the truck and headed for food. The drugstore beside the fast food drive-thru made him think of the oozing wounds. He stopped at the pharmacy first and picked up supplies, adding a box of condoms to his basket. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten that. Julie had taken him by surprise. He drove through the takeout joint, bought just about 2 of everything, and drove back to the hotel. He hadn't been gone more than half an hour. There was a second car in the lot when Axel drove in, but he didn't think too much of it. This place had people coming and going at all hours. Axel grabbed the bags of food and first aid supplies with one hand and the drink carrier with the other, balancing the coffees and milkshakes with ease. He felt good. Happy for the first time in a long while. He liked that he was doing something for Julie now, it felt right to him. The good feelings disappeared when he reached the basement room, and the door was standing open. Martin was sitting in the chair with Julie on his lap. There was a bright red handprint on her cheek, and a gun to her head. Rage threatened to overpower him, but he pushed it back. He needed a cool head to get Julie out of this. You all right, babe? He asked. She looked up and nodded, her eyes swollen and purple, her lower lip cracked and bleeding. You should have never left her alone, boyo, Martin said. You made it easy for me. Move into the bathroom and shut the door. I'm putting the food on the bed, bro. You should let her take it with you. It's been a long time since she ate, Axel said, setting everything carefully on the bed, except the drinks which he balanced on the rickety bedside table. He moved into the bathroom, but didn't shut the door. What do I care if the whore is hungry, Martin said. That's what she gets for leaving me. Martin pushed Julie roughly to her feet and shoved her toward the hall. When she reached the door, she grabbed the handle and slammed it hard on his gun hand. The gun dropped. Axel exploded from the bathroom and grabbed Martin around the waist, pulling him away from the door. Run, babe. Run to the office and call the heat. Axel turned his attention to Martin, who was attempting to elbow him in the gunshot wound in his side. They locked together, both trying for the upper hand. Axel used his height and weight advantages to fling Martin on the floor. He hit the bedside table, and the coffee and milkshakes tumbled from the table and soaked him. Martin jumped up, pulling his soaking and obviously hot shirt over his head. His pants were covered in frozen dairy. He didn't seem to know which end to clean up first. Axel spotted the gun at the same moment Martin started to reach for it. Axel body checked him sideways, away from the gun, sending Martin onto the bed and Julie's breakfast. For some reason, the ruined breakfast sent him into a rage. He slammed his elbow into Martin's face, knocking Martin silly and causing a massive nosebleed. "I've got the gun," Julie said from behind him. "You can get up, Axel." He made a fist and slammed it into Martin's face. The crunch of breaking nose made him grin. "Take that, you bastard," he thought. "Axel. Stop," Julie shouted. "You have to stop now." "He ruined your breakfast," Axel said. "That's why I went out. I knew you needed to eat and he's ruined it." He started forward again, the
censored
to smash in Martin's face, overwhelming him. "I called the cops, Axel." "You've got to get out of here," Julie said. "I can't just leave you with this guy," Axel's mind was reeling. "I can hide in the bathroom." "No. You can't. If you get caught here, it will be my fault. I don't want you to go to jail. Please, Axel, for me." He's practically unconscious and I've got the gun. The sound of sirens reached their ears and panic sprang onto her face. She looked at him, pleading with her eyes. He grabbed his duffel and ran up the stairs, out behind the motel and over the dusty field to the woods. He'd wait there until everything calmed down and he could go back to claim his truck. He watched as a stream of cop cars pulled in, sirens blaring. Soon the parking lot was full of flashing blue lights, and there were cops stationed all over the place, guns drawn. He couldn't see them pull Martin out of the basement, but pretty soon the cars started pulling away, until only the forensics team was left. It was dark before Axel felt safe enough to make his way back across the field. He stopped in at the office and paid off the manager. It was the one way to make sure the motel stayed a good place to hide. After that, he got in his truck and drove. It was time for him to start making some changes in his life. Chapter 5. Julie rode away from the motel in a squad car. She saw Axel's truck in the parking lot, but he was nowhere to be seen, thank goodness. She should have turned Axel in. That would have been the best thing for him. Maybe a little time in jail would have scared him straight. She sighed and closed her eyes. She just couldn't do that to him. If only she didn't care so much, maybe she could do the right thing. She just couldn't seem to stop caring. The cops fed her while they were taking her statement. The tall brown-haired officer who brought the food said she looked as if she was about to fall over from hunger. He wasn't far wrong. She hadn't left Axel's side while he was recovering. She hadn't really slept or eaten for more than 2 days now. "Why didn't you go to the cops when this guy turned bad?" asked the interrogating officer. "They've got good cops in the city." "He would have killed me," she said. "It was easier just to leave town. I didn't think he knew where I was from. I was wrong." She sat in the interrogation room for a long time after she gave her statement. Finally, the 2 men who'd questioned her came back in. "The city PD raided his house. What they found matched what you said, so we're letting you go. I expect you'll have to testify." Julie nodded, and they led her out to the waiting room. Her mother and father were there, waiting for her. Julie and her mother burst into tears. Her father said none of that, in an especially kind tone, and took them home. Julie spent a couple of days just eating and sleeping, until one day she woke and finally felt normal. She went downstairs to the kitchen where her mother was drinking a cup of coffee and talking to the dog. "Well, you look much better," her mom said. "How about some coffee cake?" Coffee cake was her mother's food of choice when she wanted to discuss something. Julie sighed inwardly. She wasn't in the mood for a lecture, but she sat obediently. "Mom," Julie said when her mother set the cake and coffee in front of her, "I think I want to go to college." "Oh, thank God," her mother said. "I've been so worried about what would happen to you. What will you study?" "I was thinking maybe law, so I could help women like me." She saw the frown on her mother's face and forged on. "You know, women who are abused and don't know how to get out of bad situations. But I'm just going to start by going to community college and seeing where it takes me, education-wise. I don't plan on moving out of here again for a long while." Her mother smiled. "I think that is a lovely start, Julie," she said. "Go to college and meet some nice normal people. Your father will like that." After breakfast, Julie told her mother that she was going down to the community college to see about registering. She felt guilty as she pulled the minivan out onto the street. She was going to the college, she hadn't lied about that, but she also should have told her mom that she was going to look for Axel. She wanted to thank him and tell him goodbye. She still really liked him. In fact, she thought she was probably in love with him, but she couldn't live that life. She couldn't spend her life running from the law and seeing Axel get beaten up by rival gangs. Julie couldn't tell her mother that. There was no way she'd understand Julie's need to see Axel. She wouldn't understand her need to have closure. Julie kept an eye out for Axel as she drove through the town and onto the highway, but she didn't see him. She drove 30 minutes south to the slightly larger town, San Marco, where the community college campus was housed. Julie parked near the admissions building in a parking lot. It had rows of trees separating the rows of spaces. The whole campus was green and forested, big lawns with trees dotting the common areas. Her heart was beating with anticipation and nerves as she walked into the air-conditioned admissions building. There was a pretty blonde woman behind the counter who smiled and encouraged her. The next thing Julie knew, she was in a friendly office with a college advisor. After an hour meeting with an advisor, Julie was set up with her classes. A returning student showed her around campus, pointing out the buildings where her classes would be held. They wandered into Wilson Hall, where the freshman seminar would be held. Julie gaped at the size of the room. "How many students are there in freshman seminar?" she asked, a small kernel of panic building inside her. "I think we had 250 in my frosh class," the girl said. "It seems big, but it's not really. There are bunches of TAs to help." "Ta?" Julie asked. "Teacher's assistant. They're pretty good at what they do." She led the way back out into the sunshine. Julie tried to keep the panic down. 250 people in one class, she was bound to fall through the cracks. The other student put a hand on her shoulder. "Stop worrying. You'll be fine. It's community college, it's their job to get you through." Julie felt the world start to spin around her. "You'd better sit down." The girl led her to a bench under a tree and gently pushed her head down between her knees. "Stay here," she said, and ran off. Julie stayed, feeling foolish. She wondered what people were thinking as they passed by, but it wasn't long before a paramedic was crouched in front of her taking her vital signs. "I'm okay," Julie said. "I've been under a lot of stress is all. I think I should go home now." Julie went to get up, but the paramedic put a hand on her arm, holding her down. "Sweetheart, your blood pressure is unstable. I want to take you in for observation." "But my mom's car," Julie cried out. "We'll be perfectly safe in the parking lot until either of you can pick it up. Now here are my team, we're going to wheel you out of here." Julie assented, and they strapped her onto a gurney and wheeled her to the ambulance. Julie blushed with embarrassment. This was so mortifying. She was admitted and held at the hospital overnight. Her mother brought her toiletries and fresh clothing after her collecting the minivan from college. "You don't have to do this, you know, Julie," her mom said. She was sitting on Julie's hospital bed, holding her hand. "Your Uncle Henry needs a file girl in his office. It doesn't pay much, but you could live at home until you get some savings built up." "No, Mom. I'm going to college. I want a profession, not just a job. I can do this." Julie surprised herself. There had been a time when the best she would have hoped for would have been an office job. "I am going to help women and children," she said. "Even if it takes me 10 years to get through school, I'm going to do this." "Well, okay then," said her father. "It's about time you starting standing up for yourself." He punched her lightly on the shoulder. "I don't know what happened to you in the city, but if this is the result, then maybe it was worth it." "Don't be silly," her mother said. She was in a horrible situation. How could it possibly be worth it? But Julie secretly thought her father was right. She was released from the hospital the next day and took the bus downtown to search for Axel. She looked in all their old haunts, the coffee shop where he asked her to drive for him, the old octopus, the pub where she'd first seen him drinking and coming on to the girls. She tried the car wash and the taco place, but she couldn't find him anywhere. She went and stood on the sidewalk outside the building where Axel lived, but she didn't have the courage to go in. She didn't know the apartment number, and there was a scary-looking guy leaning on the wall next to the door. Not a doorman, more like a door thug. She stood there until the thug noticed her and started staring. Then she went home. Julie dug in her drawer for her old cell phone, the one she'd left behind when she went to the city. She flipped it open, but it was dead. She plugged it in and tried to forget about Axel, but she needed to say goodbye. To make him understand that she loved him, but she couldn't be with him because he was a criminal. She believed he could go straight, but only if he wanted it. If he had a reason that meant something to him. She didn't know what that reason might be, but if he could find it, he could be free. The phone beeped, indicating that it had charged. But she had changed her mind. If she was only chasing him down because she believed deep down that he loved her and would change for her, she was destined for disappointment. Surely the city had taught her that. She threw the phone back in a drawer. Chapter 6. The first thing Axel did after retrieving his truck at the motel was to drive to San Marco and rent an apartment. If he was going to get out from under Eduardo, he needed a bolt hole. Then he went back to his first apartment to assess the situation and decide what he owned that he could do without. As he packed his clothes, he thought about his plan. Should he take on Eduardo or the cops first? He decided he'd better see the police chief first. He carried his boxes and a couple of suitcases to his car. Raj, who was stationed outside the basement door, asked if he was going on a trip. No, Axel said, faking nonchalance he didn't feel, just getting rid of some stuff. Raj saluted and said, "Carry on." On his way back in, Raj stopped him. "Remember that girl you used as a driver that time?" Raj asked. Axel nodded. She was standing on the sidewalk across the street from the lobby earlier today. I was going to ask what she wanted, but she disappeared. Axel thought Raj had probably taken so long to work up the energy to walk across the street that Julia just got tired of waiting and went away. "Don't bother with her," he said. "She's not worth your time." Raj saluted again, and Axel went up for one last sweep through his apartment. He left the most of his belongings behind. If it could be replaced, it was worth it for him to look like he was still living there. He drove to his Van Markel apartment and unloaded the car. It was important for it to look like he dropped his trash while he was here. He showered and changed, thinking it would be nice to have furniture, so he paid the apartment manager to let delivery men in. Then he drove into town and stopped at a family-run store he shopped at before. He made their sales quota for the month, paying for furniture as well as delivery and setup. The next time he walked into his apartment, it should look like home, right down to the plates on the table. That done, he slid back into his car, cranked the air conditioner, and drove back to his hometown. He went straight to the police department, walked to the reception window, and gave his name. Then he asked to see the chief. Axel got a lot of satisfaction out of how quickly everyone started moving when he said his name. He was big stuff, and he was about to give them even bigger stuff. It was a near thing. Axel could tell the chief was itching to get to him, but Axel waylaid him with the offer of a bigger fish. In fact, the biggest fish in this podunk town. "You've got to let me go in first and bring Eduardo down. If I don't assert my dominance, those assholes will be dogging me for the rest of my life. That's a deal breaker." In the end, the chief agreed. They set a date a few days away to give all the parties involved time to get ready. Next, Axel went to see a man he had been avoiding for a very long time, asked for forgiveness, and got his job back. It helped when you had family on the board of trustees. The worst of it over, he went back to the new apartment, still no furniture, not that he was surprised, and changed back into his gang clothes. Then he drove back to the old apartment and walked in like he owned the place, his senses on high alert in case there was a snitch in the police. He laid low for several days, until the time came for action. On the day he was calling Operation Free Axel, he took the elevator to the top floor. As he stepped into the vestibule, he incapacitated the two guards by snapping the fingers on their trigger hands and knocking them unconscious. He opened the door to Eduardo's apartment and took a minute to assess the situation. There was a goon out on the roof, his back to the glass doors, and Eduardo was on the couch with a different blonde than last time. Axel wondered what Eduardo's wife thought about the revolving blondes. Axel stepped into the living room. "Better send her to the back," Axel said, indicating the blonde. "I've got news." Eduardo joked his head in surprise and sent the girl away. "What's up?" he asked. Axel stepped forward and grabbed Eduardo's dominant hand, breaking his fingers. Then he twisted that arm up behind Eduardo's back and held there with the lightest of pressures on the broken digits. "Push the panic button," Axel said. "Are you crazy? The boys will kill you." Eduardo's voice was 2 registers higher than normal. "Only if they kill you first. Push the button." Axel applied the tiniest pressure to Eduardo's broken fingers, and Eduardo quickly reached under the table and pushed the button. The building erupted in the noise of men in heavy boots running up the stairs. As the first man burst into the room, he stopped frozen at the sight of Axel with a gun to Eduardo's head. As more and more men arrived, they pushed into the room, the front line of men being pushed closer and closer. It would have been humorous if Axel hadn't known that this was freedom or death. If he got it wrong, he wouldn't live to walk out of this room. When the noise in the stairwells stopped, Axel performed a mental count and calculated that everyone was here. He spoke. "Does everyone see this?" he asked in a voice so low they had to strain to hear him. Axel indicated the gun that he held to their boss's head. The men nodded. "Does anyone dispute that I'm now the lord of this house?" Again his voice was low. There was a mass head shaking this time. "Good. I want you to know that as is my right, I am disbanding this community. Should I see any of your faces ever again, I will shoot you on sight and without question." Again they nodded. At that moment the entire police department plus at least 2 more from the surrounding areas burst in through the stairwells, the roof, the windows and even the elevator shaft. It was fall before Axel went looking for Julie, even though he knew she was nearby. He had completed his transformation, including having the worst of his tattoos removed. But not all of them. A man had to have some autonomy. He spotted Julie walking from class, freshman seminar he guessed, and fell into step beside her. Julie looked at him and smiled her polite smile, the one she reserved for strangers. He had to choke back laughter when she did a double take and stood stock still on the path. "Axel?" She looked both pleased and frightened. "Professor Kehoe to you," he said sternly. "What? Professor?" She looked around and sat on a nearby bench. "Are you really professor here?" she asked. "Adjunct professor of criminal studies, law enforcement and prison culture," he said. "For a start." "I didn't know you were qualified," she said, still somewhat dazed. "Back before I fell in with the wrong crowd," Axel said. "I'm not as uncultured as you might think." "I never thought you were uncultured," she said. "You are a very cultured criminal." "Cultured ex-criminal," he said pointedly. "Really? Ex-criminal?" "Yes." And he held out his hand to her. "Why don't you come back to my place, and I'll show you just how reformed I am." He pulled her to her feet, and she threw her arms around him. When they broke apart, he walked her the 3 blocks to his apartment. There was so much heat between them, they could barely get through the door. He pushed her up against the wall and
censored
her with all the gentleness of a werewolf at the full moon. She pushed him away. "I tried to find you," she said. "I wanted to tell you that I loved you, but I couldn't live a life of crime." She sounded sad, and Axel couldn't bear it. "There will be none of that," he said. He pulled her through the living room and into his bedroom, which was dominated by a king-sized bed. She got the better of him, twirled him around and pushed him backwards onto the bed, climbing on top of him. She sat on his stomach, grinning down at him. "None of what?" she asked. None of any of it, he said. No crime, no sadness, no lowlifes, no prison. Good, she said. I won't tolerate any of that. In fact, I think I must punish you for the crimes of the past. She bent down and
censored
him full on the lips. Axel reached up to pull her flat against him, but she batted his hands away. You are forgetting this is your punishment, she said. Lay still.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
Julie slid down next to Axel, resting her head on his
censored,
and he pulled her close. Why did you decide to give up your life of crime? She asked. It had to be more lucrative than teaching community college students. I had my reasons, he said softly. She smacked him on the shoulder. Yes, and I'm asking what they are, she said. Babe, he said. It was because I knew you wouldn't have me unless I went straight. So I had to. Too right, she said crossly, smacking him sharply on the
censored.
Don't you forget it. But Axel could see her face in the reflection of the dresser mirror. Julie was smiling, she was his forever. Thank you for reading my book. If you like this story, I think you'll enjoy my author friend's book Rough Start, free now. Here's an exclusive sneak peek for your eyes only. Tap tap tap. Eliana drummed her finger pensively on the side of her amber coffee mug, as she stared vacantly at the newspaper that lay open on her round dining table. Her chestnut-colored eyes were glazed over, a sure sign her thoughts were far away. The sun had only just crested the horizon, and from the east-facing window of her suburban home in Concord, the light was casting an orange haze throughout the kitchen. Light refracted off the glistening ink of the newspaper. Eliana took a step forward from her position, leaning against the counter to lessen the glare from the image she'd been transfixed on. There it was again. In all its dreadful glory, staring up at her in an almost taunting manner, was the nearly page-sized portrait of her father. Right at the top of the obituary section. It must have been the extra money she spent for the space that made his notoriety so prominent. Lord knows it wasn't on the merit of his conduct that gave him the honored position at the top of the page. Henry Granville, born April 2, 1958, passed peacefully in sleep on the 10th of September 2019. Born and raised in rural Maine, Henry worked with dedication for over 3 decades at Pine Hill Lumber Mill. His late wife passed only 6 years after their marriage, leaving him a single father to their daughter and his only surviving family, Eliana. He was a loving father, loyal, hardworking. Blah. 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 Setting her cup down with force onto the table, Eliana paced to the window and stared angrily at the front lawn. Her hands gripped the windowsill, knuckles white with strain. Her breathing had become more ragged, and the heat in her
censored
was rising to the back of her neck. Why the words made her so angry was nearly comical. Hadn't she written them herself? As a young but accomplished defense attorney, she wasn't one for fiction writing. Maybe this was one last attempt to be a good daughter. A short story of wishful thinking that would make her father, her dead father, proud. Memories of their last encounter together flooded her mind. Pale, sickly ill, and though largely obese, he'd seemed too frail in the hospital bed with tubes in every orifice, monitors beeping and humming. His murky eyes had been searching the room frantically. His hands gripped the sheets in terror as he struggled for his next breath. The lung cancer had won. Eliana had been caught by his right hand. With strange force, he'd pulled her close, nearly toppling her on the bed, and he'd pressed his thumb firmly into her palm. Eliana stared in horror as he sputtered his last breath. Despite her perfectly working lungs, Eliana felt herself clutching at her throat as though suffocating, as she forced the memory out of her mind. Her left hand still hurt where he'd driven his thumb into her palm. Her anger as her own lies in the obituary faded into a strange feeling, somewhere between grief and pity. How terrible it would be to suffocate to death. Betrayed by your own body. Cancer is a cow, she thought scornfully. Startled by the hiss of the coffee maker, she turned from the window and switched the machine off. Her eyes caught the time and she cursed under her breath. She was going to be late. Darting from the kitchen and down the hall, she raced up the stairs and into the bathroom that adjoined her yellow and teal decorated bedroom. As she opened the door, vapor poured out like fog, and Eliana turned the shower off. Using the shower to steam clean her black dress, she pulled it free from the hanger on the shower rod and stepped into her room. Her bathrobe fell in a pool around her feet before she stepped into the tea-length cotton blend dress that was trimmed with lace. She was still struggling to slip her heels on as she descended the stairs and into the kitchen. With one arm in her khaki pea coat, she pulled a tumbler from the cupboard and set it next to her forgotten mug. With haste, she poured the contents of the coffee pot into the traveler, nearly half sloshing onto the table, before she screwed the lid on, grabbed her purse and car keys from the entryway and left the house, locking the door behind her. Unable to help it, she found herself staring back at her home of only 14 months in the rearview mirror of her silver Mercedes. The perfectly situated white house was in the exact center of the cul-de-sac. She'd fallen in love with it the moment the realtor had suggested it. It was the first house she'd been able to buy, and it stood as a mark of pride. How far she'd come in the last 3 years since she'd graduated from Harvard. Even farther in the last 10 when she'd moved from Maine. How different it was from the house she'd grown up in. The town. The people, how different she was now. 38. There were 38 people at the funeral. Eliana knew this because, from her standing position in the back of the church, she had counted them over and over again. The hour drive from her home to the steeple-capped building hadn't been long enough. 60 minutes wasn't enough time to prepare herself for the blur of the funeral. Among the 38 people, she'd counted 12 cousins, 2 aunts, 6 uncles, a few of her father's former co-workers and at least a dozen others who'd probably only wandered in for the food. She could feel the bitter scowl on her face, but she was startled as every single face turned from the front of the church to look at her. All 38 of them. Standing more erect, her eyes darted to the minister who was looking at her expectantly. Miss Granville, the middle-aged, yellow-haired minister for hire asked, "You had a few words?" "Oh," was all she could say as she pushed herself forward. Her heels clicked on the wood floor as she walked up the aisle and shook the Reverend's hand before taking her place behind the pulpit, the open casket at her back. "We've gathered here today," she thought sardonically, as she fished into the pocket of her dress and removed her note cards. She muttered as she straightened her immaculately constructed eulogy. "My father. Henry." For some reason, her cards were impossible to read. Why were they blurry? Looking up momentarily, she realized the entire church and its 38 onlookers were blurry as well. Touching a hand to her face, she realized the culprit of her sudden case of vision loss wasn't cataracts, but tears. She was crying. "I'm sorry, I'm." Her heart began racing, and she feared she was about to lose all composure. Public speaking was never a paralyzing fear for her, but public blubbering was another matter altogether. Wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, she forced a small laugh to attempt to ease the tensions within herself. "My father was a hard-working man who had no time for sentiment," she began, eyes still stinging painfully, "or tears." A few among them chuckled. God bless her sensible cousins. Let's be honest, we all knew a different side of Henry Granville. At work he was devoted, clever, and painfully faithful. His crew were like brothers to him. More so than his actual brothers. A few more laughs gave her encouragement. Among his family, he was the life of the party. I think he laughed more at the reunions than anyone. Especially after a few drinks, he was a man who enjoyed a good drink. Or a bad one, he wasn't picky. "You weren't any help with that peach moonshine you peddled that weekend at Moosehead Lake, Uncle Ron." The assembly roared with laughter, including the red-faced man in the second row. "At home my dad was?" She felt a sudden lump in her throat. "My dad, he." The stinging in her eyes had returned, and instinctively she turned her back to the room, forgetting that in that motion she came face to face with the lifeless body of her father who rested in the casket. A sudden wave of nausea hit her, and her already tear-dampened hands were useless as she tried to quell the onslaught of tears. Staring bluntly and boldly at her clearly deceased father, she couldn't help but come to the realization that her tears were not entirely of loss, but God help her, they were in relief. He was gone, and with him the dread she'd lived with every day. She'd never again come home to find him passed out drunk on the floor having
censored
himself in the process. There would never be another missed event, argument, drunken rage, or emotional breakdown. Eliana would never have to endure another broken promise or failed attempt at sobriety or disappointment from him again. He was gone. Forever. With one hand over her mouth, she silenced the maddening laughter that threatened to burst forth. From behind her, she could hear the murmuring and whispering that was steadily growing louder. Among the voices, a single bold and heavy footfall rattled the ground, and Eliana felt a figure approach. Thank heaven the minister was coming to relieve her failed speech. A strong hand held a tissue to her, and she turned just enough to accept it. However, the figure next to her was far too tall to be Reverend Matthew. Thank you. Drying her eyes, she looked from the ground where her cream-colored heels were pointed toward a set of large black leather boots, up dark denim jeans covering broad thighs and hips. A black leather cut was draped over a crisp white button-down shirt that was left open at the collar, revealing tan skin at the throat, and did nothing to conceal the hardened
censored
beneath. Dark stubble dusted a pointed chin, square jaw, and faded into slicked-back black hair that curled ever so slightly at the ends. Light blue eyes grew darker toward the pupils that stared down at her. Kai? Eliana was shamelessly searching for him. He could tell by the way her eyes danced around the room, even while engaged in conversation with others. Despite his height, he prided himself on his ability to fade into the background and go unnoticed. It was easier to stay distant. Kai Driscoll had learned at an early age to be observant at all costs. Observant and distant. He'd meant to keep his presence at the funeral secret, but when he'd watched Eliana struggling, he was unable to keep himself tucked away. Her relatives among the pews hadn't the sense to come to her aid, so he'd stepped up to the task. Eliana was never a woman to seem meek. Perhaps that was why it pained him to watch her struggling to contain her emotions. Despite her taller-than-average height, especially in those shoes that made her slender legs look a mile long, she'd seem so childlike and small. Seeing her again was like stepping back in time. Her hair was shorter now than he remembered. Probably opting for a more modern cut, the chocolate tresses she'd since straightened were cut into a smart bob, the length of which barely brushed the tops of her shoulders. With her back turned, he'd been granted a view of the milky skin of her neck. She'd finally looked up at him through tear-soaked eyelashes, and he'd almost reached a hand up to take her by the neck and keep her face fixed toward his. Almost. Now, as he watched her dance between attendants who were happy enough to keep themselves fed, he quietly followed her from the church as she made her way to the front parking lot. She stood with her back to him, giving him another glorious view of the soft skin of the back of her neck, arms wrapped around herself at the impending cold of autumn. Head turning from side to side, she spotted his motorcycle parked on the grass under the overhanging beech tree. She moved quickly toward the V-twin engine Shadow that stood out amongst the four-door cars and vans on the gravel lot. Kai finally relented to put her out of her misery, as she clearly wasn't going to stop searching until she found him. The sheen of midnight blue paint reflected her face as he stood behind her. Seeing his own face looking at her, she turned around quickly to look up at him once again, only this time her eyes were wide and dry. I was looking for you, she admitted, her left hand resting on one of the handlebars. It didn't escape his notice that her hand remained ringless. You found me, he replied shortly. Rather you found me, she stated, having regained herself from surprise. I couldn't believe it was you. I felt surrounded by ghosts today. The past has a way of feeling like that, Kai said, and lifted his right hand, the one that brandished a rather prominent silver ring with the letters SD, to brush the hair off her shoulder. She shivered. Kai, she spoke his name, and he felt the hair on his arms prickle. Thank you for earlier. I was making a spectacle of myself up there. Some things never change, he cooed with a grin. You were never one for subtlety. One of us had to be blunt, Eliana defended, her light brown eyes full of defiance. Their eyes locked, and the air between them felt charged as though humming with electricity. Behind them, the church bells began to toll, and Kai used her momentary distraction as the crowd began to pour out of the stone structure to take her wrist firmly and pull her to the opposite side of the tree out of sight. "Kai," she cried as he pressed her back against the trunk, and his hand flew to her mouth to silence her. His breathing was coming in short rasps, and with one hand over her mouth, the other on the tree above her head, there was barely a whisper of air between them. Indeed, when she took a sharp breath, her
censored
brushed his and Kai squeezed his eyes shut. They remained like that for several long moments, until the rumble of vehicles departing had ceased. He could sense her discomfort as she began to squirm, and he pressed his hand more firmly against her lips. "Eli, listen to me," he demanded, his voice eerily deep and calm. When he opened his eyes again to look down at her, it wasn't with familiarity or friendliness, not even with attraction and
censored,
but with a warning. She stilled instantly. "I came here for a reason. There has been a long-standing debt between your father and the screaming demons. One that I'm sent to collect on." Her eyes went from wide and fearful to narrowed and angry in an instant. She pulled his hand off her mouth and gave his
censored
a firm shove. "My father's dealings with your gang don't include me. I've paid enough of a price for his involvement." She made to walk away, but Kai took her by the waist and had her up against the tree again in a flash. "You might think you've paid, but the debt Henry accrued is much higher than your meager pains." "Meager?" She spat, pushing against him again. "Meager? You really are a bastard, aren't you?" "Yes, I am." "Then what money is it? How much did he take?" 50,000. 50,000? Plus 10 years interest. Likely more for the insult of betrayal. That could be any amount. Hundreds of thousands. A million? They don't pay 28-year-old lawyers that much, Kai. Might as well have saved yourself the trip. A life? His short sentence had her balking. "A life," he repeated. "Yours? I've come to collect. Today. Get your copy of Rough Start. A big favor to ask. I would really love it if you could take a few seconds to leave me a review. Thank you so much in advance." About the author. Selina Coffey is a romance writer who lives happily in London with her husband and son. She is a hopeless romantic who grew up always believing in love, and she is not ashamed to admit this. It is this belief that makes her so passionate about writing crazy love stories. A stereotypical girly girl, she loves shopping. So whenever she gets a chance and the spare cash, you will probably find her browsing online for the next pair of shoes to add to her collection. You can find her online at www.selinacoffey.com. Contact her at hello@selinacoffey.com. Closing credits. This has been His Temptation. Written by Selina Coffey. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited. Production copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited.